Good day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Governance and Policy podcast by Adam Smith Center, Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-market values. The aim of this podcast is educational to demonstrate the importance of economics, public policy ideas, and the humanities in general. I'm Joshua, and I'll be the host for today's episode. Today, we are joined by Jordan McGillis, who will speak on climate change and environmentalism in the COVID era. Jordan is currently the Deputy Director of Policy at the Institute of Energy Research in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today, Jordan.
Thanks for having me, Joshua. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
All right. So if we were to start off with like a general question first for our viewers, what is the role of government, if any, in tackling environmental issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, something that I think about as someone who shares the general outlook of the Adam Smith Center of being pro-markets and pro-property rights is that these institutions, property in particular, are excellent ways of conserving environmental values and of people expressing what they do value. And government, first and foremost, has a role of enforcing property rights and upholding them. And so what we have seen historically through the English common law is that courts are a great mechanism for people to take grievances before government that are based in questions of the environment, whether it's a neighbor or a factory that's upstream. When you have these conflicts of how to use property, water, land, and even air, the government should be there to enforce people's rights to utilize their property in the ways that they see fit, to express their own visions for a happy and healthy life. However, it's now the case that legislation coming from national governments and further international treaties have become a large part of environmental policy. And as a result, many people feel dispossessed of that local investment and local character of environmental concerns. Something that the English philosopher Roger Scruton talks about is oikophilia, which is love of the home. And he says that that's the real root of healthy environmentalism. And I tend to agree. People value the areas that are around them, and they want to have lovely and healthy environments. But when national and international coalitions of governments are co-opting that process, people on the ground often feel that they're being oppressed rather than helped by government action with respect to the environment.
All right. So, okay, with that in mind, what was the progress and state of the global environmentalism before the COVID pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Well, once again, I think the core of a healthy environmentalism is oikophilia, the love of home. And what we've seen is that in wealthy parts of the world, such as Singapore, such as Scandinavia, people do invest money in environmental goods. In your city-state, there are beautiful green spaces that are preserved. Buildings often have green spaces built into them. But if you look at places that are less wealthy, there isn't the same degree of consideration for that because people don't have the security and the economic well-being to the extent that they're able to devote mental effort to these other concerns. So when people get richer, when they feel happier, they often devote some of their time and attention to environmental issues. And we've seen that with the environmental improvements in places like I've mentioned, and indeed in the United States, where our emissions of what we call the criteria pollutants are down by a very significant degree over the last 30 or 40 years. And even our greenhouse gas emissions are down if you want to look at it from the perspective of global warming. So there are these improvements, and much of the improvement comes from wealthy people being able to invest more in new technologies and just invest more attention to the environment. But there are many parts of the world where people simply are unable to give attention to those issues at this time. I think first and foremost of India and Indonesia, two very large countries, of course, where they have a long way to go to get to the level of economic development that we enjoy. And it's going to be challenging for the whole world, particularly on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions and the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as these economies get up to speed and continue to grow, because the surest, quickest path to wealth is through low cost energy, and the low cost sources of coal and natural gas do have that greenhouse gas emitting side effect.
All right. So, how has COVID or the coronavirus shifted public attention on environmental issues or affected the movement and its progress?
Mm-hmm. I can speak most knowledgeably about the United States here, so I'll keep my comments to what I've seen here where I live.
All right.
And what we face right now is a situation in which our political future is very much in flux. We have a election at the federal level coming later this year. It'll be in November. And at that time, many of the state level offices and local offices will also be up for election. So people have this sense that there's an opportunity for enacting whatever it is that they think is the appropriate approach on energy and the environment. And the COVID crisis has really heightened that, because we're in an economic collapse right now. Our government is making a lot of rash decisions as it is. And lobbyists and special interests and well-intentioned people as well are viewing the landscape as being one in which they can have an impact that they may not have been able to have before. There are new opportunities for influence. A colloquial phrase we have is the Overton window. And what we're describing when we use that term is the range of possible political changes or ideas that are acceptable to a society at a given time. And people think that the Overton window is widening or perhaps even moving so that new policies could be enacted. My organization, as a group that prioritizes property rights, free markets, and liberty, thinks that it's really important that we don't place more burdens on people economically as they face these times of strife economically. We have unemployment right now in the United States that I believe is verging on 20%, if not higher. People are out of work, companies are going out of business, and to use this opportunity to enact a carbon tax or something like that, I think would be rather cruel. We saw in Canada that Justin Trudeau paused their increased carbon tax. Actually, Joshua, that's incorrect. Now that I think about it, they enacted their carbon tax on April 1st. They did not pause. They chose to go through with it, I believe. And, we should go back and check that. I'm not 100% sure. But what I do know is they had a carbon tax that was scheduled to increase on April 1st. And I am of the opinion that it would have been wise. And if they indeed did pause it, that was the correct decision. There are others that think this would be the optimal time to introduce a carbon tax. And there's some logic to that if you believe a carbon tax is an appropriate policy, because prices for things like gasoline and crude oil are very low right now. Yeah. So people who are using those fuels wouldn't experience the tax as harshly as they would when prices are high. But of course, as prices climb back to a normal level, then they will experience that and they will be burdened significantly. Brent crude, as we're recording this today on the 2nd of June for me, the 3rd of June for you, has climbed back over $40 per barrel. So prices are going to climb back. And I think it would be an inappropriate time, if ever there were a proper time, to implement a carbon tax or something like that.
All right. So currently in this situation, do you think it's possible for governments, policymakers, NGOs, and the general public to balance these environmental and public health concerns? Or at least, let's narrow down to like the general public as of the moment. How, on the ground, do you think the sentiment is that people are looking at both of these issues equally, or are they prioritizing one, or at least in your state, or how much you can talk about it?
Well, what we've seen is a lot of people drawing parallels between climate change as a long-term issue and the coronavirus pandemic here as an immediate threat. We see this both from the skeptics of climate change, who are saying that the models we've seen on coronavirus and the the level of contagion we should expect have been fluctuating, and they haven't been borne out in many places. There's been a lot of uncertainty. We've seen some countries that have had very little spread, others that have had widespread death and despair. So they're using this opportunity to point out that modeling is perhaps useful, but should not be a determinant of policy ipso facto. On the other side of the equation, the camp that is concerned about climate change and would like government to step in to mitigate emissions is saying the coronavirus is like climate change condensed into a short time span. And since we do have more time to deal with climate change, we should use this crisis to inform us and to make decisions now so that we don't face damage in the future. And I think there are some flaws on both sides and some reasonable points on both sides. The biggest flaw that I would point out in drawing the parallel between the epidemiological crisis and between climate change is that on the one hand, climate change is an entirely global issue. We're talking about atmospheric concentrations of gases. There's no way for any local government, any state government, any national government to exclude the effects of climate change from their territory. Country that you live in, Singapore, sea level change is a legitimate threat in the future. What you can't do, though, is you don't really have much of an ability as the government of Singapore, as a citizen of Singapore, to really affect global emissions levels and really affect global concentrations. You're just one very small fraction of the whole emissions total. So you don't have a lot of control over that aspect. What you do have control over is how you manage property, how you plan for the future. So there are many adaptation strategies that a country can take with respect to climate change. But on the other hand, with respect to the coronavirus crisis, there are immediate steps that a country can take or a city can take to prevent contagion within that country or from getting into the country. And something like a travel ban or a quarantine really can be effective. If you quarantine people who are coming from a place where there is widespread viral contagion, when they enter the country, you can really prevent the population in the place where they're coming to from being affected. You can't do the same thing with the emissions. We can't stop the emissions that are coming from China from affecting global temperatures. But what we can do is immediately act on something like coronavirus. So the parallel breaks down quite a bit, but it certainly is the case that there are actions that can be taken on climate change. I think the most important thing, though, is to focus on adaptation, where all national governments and local governments and private property owners can really have an influence on safeguarding for the future.
All right. So moving forward, what policy solutions or actions do you think governing bodies can pursue in the wake of this current situation?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that this highlights a big difference between the current crisis, which is one in which there's a lot of local ability to enact an immediate stop on the spread. And then the distinction being with climate change, it's more about how can we adapt to a future of higher temperatures, to whatever extent that may come. So what I think we need to do as governments is get out of the way of efficient economic decision-making that enables people to utilize property in ways that they see fit to deal with the potential challenges that they see in the future. In the United States, there are 3 very simple things that I think we could do to make us better able to handle changes that may come. The first thing I would point to is removing the sorts of policies that are encouraging people to emit more because of government policy. So one clear example of that is our zoning laws in the United States. And that's primarily a local issue. Places like San Francisco are notorious for having very restrictive policies on where and how you can build housing. And so what this does is it creates a much flatter urban landscape than you would see in a place like New York City, which is our best example of a strong urban core, or Singapore, where there are many, many high rises. People live in tall buildings. In San Francisco, where I'm based, most of the buildings are only a few stories high, and so it's spread out over a great distance, and people are commuting much further distances than they otherwise would. They're living in single family homes often that are less energy efficient. And many people would love to live in denser urban cores where they're able to have better access to amenities and things like that. And they're simply unable to do so because these local land policies, the zoning laws, make it impossible for them to do what they'd like to. So first, I would get rid of things like that, which are artificially amplifying our emissions through causing us to drive more and through putting more people into single family homes, which are less energy efficient. I'd also point to reforming insurance laws in the United States, which as they currently exist, often incentivize people to build new houses and to rebuild houses that have been damaged from environmental catastrophes such as fires out in what we call the wildlife urban interface, and from floods. We have something called the National Flood Insurance Program, which basically pays people over and over to rebuild their houses, their property in floodplains that we know are very high risk. If we were able to make that system more rational, more market-based, we would see people take prices into account, and they would vacate from low-lying areas such as certain places along the Mississippi River, which runs through the center of the country, and down in southern Louisiana is another example where most of the land is very close to sea level, if not below it. And many people will find that to be a sad thing, that people may need to move to different areas to restart their lives, but that's just part of human life. We're a very adaptable species, and we're more than capable of finding places for us to thrive. With respect to the fires, in California, the state government actually has barred insurance companies from ceasing to renew policies on homes that they deem too risky. So even though an insurance company may say, our assessment is that this particular place for a home would be a little bit more risk than we'd like to take on, they are now prevented from allowing a policy to expire, and they're forced to renew. So all that's doing is driving up costs for everyone else and ultimately causing more people who aren't attuned to these issues to live in that dangerous area. So those are two things. Another example where, and you may contest this, but I think that you in Singapore are onto something with your road pricing. Almost all of our roads in the United States are unpriced. And so that's just another incentive that people have to live really, really far from where they work or where they go to school. They're not personally taking into account the cost of maintaining the road and then concomitantly the emissions. So we have these policies in the US that are driving up emissions by subsidizing people living further out and then preventing people from living further in towards cities. And we also have these insurance issues. And there are a host of other things that I consider common ground solutions, where we are actually making positive environmental changes, but also we're respecting people's preferences and their choices. And we're creating a freer economy in which people are able to trade and dispose of their property, use their property how they see fit, rather than having to answer to the local magistrates who tell them where and how they can live.
It does seem like, it does seem like it's like a difficult political situation to try and push for environmental concerns, given that, there's lots of economic problems, lots of social problems right now. Does that impact the general situation of how you guys advocate for this issue?
Well, it certainly does. As an organization, we generally cheer for lower prices. That normally resonates with us as a good thing, because consumers are able to utilize their means to both purchase their energy and then use the reserves on other things. But in this current circumstance, we're seeing a price collapse that is driving a lot of businesses under. So there's always that flip side to things. When things are getting a little bit better for the consumer, they may be getting worse for the company. So it is challenging from that standpoint. We have to remember that prices are neither good nor bad. They are simply reflections of information. It tells us right now when we see oil prices like in early May when the futures price went negative, what that's telling us is there's a lot more oil on the market than there is demand for. And when prices are when prices are high, it tells us the reverse, that there is a significant deficit between how much people want and how much is currently on offer. So I think it's very important to reiterate in the United States that we need to respect the price system. Something that's been proposed in the US to kind of prop up our domestic oil companies is an oil tariff on foreign imported oil. I would be completely opposed to that because all that's doing is it's basically incentivizing bad decision making. The companies that were prudent, that were appropriately calibrated for the current situation, they should be able to thrive. And the companies that were over leveraged, it's just part of a market process that they may need to sell off some assets, may need to be bought up by a company that's doing better. When you implement a tariff or something like that and it props up these companies, it's distorting the markets and it's creating a situation in which there's bad incentives, and it doesn't, it's what we call moral hazard, where people who have made poor decisions are bailed out. And that's not something that's good in the long run for everyone. It's shifting costs onto the general public when what markets should do is internalize costs to the best that they can. Now, there is one point that I must also make, which gives some credence to the calls for relief, and that's that government policy is largely behind why the declines in energy prices have been so steep. People have been relegated to their homes across much of the United States for the last few months, and so energy demand is much, much lower. But as I look at this from the most objective position possible, I think we have to understand that at the root of the economic crisis wasn't that government implemented lockdowns, it's that we have a global pandemic. And the United States government didn't cause the global pandemic. We would have seen significant declines in global trade and in transportation, in flights, even if our governments wouldn't have taken such sweeping and long-lasting actions.
All right. Thank you for that. So, okay, maybe just to end off, what are your views on the future of environmentalism moving forward, maybe 5 years, 10 years? How do you think the environmental effort will be impacted as countries move on from this pandemic and go on into the future, in the near future?
Well, from my perspective as someone who is very skeptical of global climate treaties, I'm somewhat hopeful that skepticism will take hold more widely. I think that the current crisis has diminished trust across the globe and between governments. I think that people in the United States and the U.S. government is very wary right now of the Chinese Communist Party, and I think it's right to be skeptical of that government. And it's really important to understand that our global climate treaties really depend on trust and openness and cooperation. If we don't have that, the Paris Agreement, for example, will not be successful. So from my perspective, I would like the US to remain out of the Paris Agreement. And so I am attempting to point out that we should indeed be skeptical of the Chinese government, and we shouldn't really trust what they're saying about their climate plans. What they have put on paper is that they will reduce their emissions beginning in the year 2030, and will reduce their carbon intensity by 20% in that year, I believe. Simultaneously, however, they're building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants, both at home and abroad through their Belt and Road Initiative. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, and the epidemiological crisis has just heightened US awareness of this duplicity that we see from that government. So if I were a climate hawk, if I were somebody who were very concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, I would be discouraged, because I think that global agreements are going to kind of stumble here. I think they're going to be really challenged because of this trust deficit. As someone who thinks that environmentalism should be home-based, should be locally based, and should come from a love of one's surroundings, I think that this may help to persuade people that that is a better way to pursue environmentalism.
All right, that was very clear. Okay, I think that's it for today, actually.
All right.
All right, thank you. I'm just gonna stop the recording.